And in linguistics, we talk about semantics. Okay? We say that, just semantics, It's become like a saying for us, because somebody uses a word and then we want to know, what do you mean when you use that word? And then the person says what they mean by that, and you might have a different meaning, and you say, it's all about semantics, But, that concept is a very important concept, because we must get away from this notion, or must be very careful rather, to assume that words just have one meaning. Words has got meaning, yes, and the meaning is determined by what? Not just what you find in the dictionary, but actually how you use it within context. Context is very important. Because there are many words I can use as examples in English where if I were just to say the word, a word like, one just comes to mind, hi. What does the word hi mean?
Greetings.
I could be greeting, but how do you know I was saying hello? I might have been talking about height. Something that's high, even though the word is spelled differently, but what you hear is the same thing. And so it is, you have to say, okay, hi, how did I say it? Because does that in some way, give you a sense of context? Was there anything that accompanied that? Did I maybe wave when I said hi? Or did I do this?
Okay.
Right? Because if I did this and I said hi, then what do you think of? Distance. But if I do this, the context tells you that that thing that sounds exactly the same, even though I know it's spelled differently when you write it out, I'm trying to make a point. So context at the end of the day actually determines what the meaning of the word is. And that's why one needs to remember and understand that words have meaning based on their context, and not just on what the dictionary tells you that word is. And that's why when you look at a dictionary, especially a good dictionary of biblical Hebrew, they'll often tell you that the word can mean this, that, or that, which is many times very closely related to each other in meaning. Okay? But sometimes it can be something completely different. Because one has to take a look at the context. Now, the same thing happens with the word Elohim. As you begin to study the word Elohim in the Bible, yes, there are many times it's actually used in reference to God, the God of the Bible. But we translate it singular when the word is actually understood to be a plural word. Now, does that mean it's a reference in the Old Testament to the Trinity? You ask Jews, they will say no. They've never understood the word Elohim, to mean that God isn't one. That's their very basic faith statement, in the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Elohim is one. There's only one God. And so they wouldn't, doesn't mean that. Now, for us in the evangelical church, we've often done that. We say, because the Hebrew word for God is Elohim and it's plural. That's proof of the Trinity. We have to be very, very careful, in terms of how we understand that and how that is to be used. Because even in the Hebrew Bible, the word Elohim can be translated in the plural, but when that normally happens in the Hebrew Bible, it's a reference to gods, to other gods. Now in our theology we will say, but there aren't any other gods. There's only one God. But you must understand, within the world of the ancient Near East, even amongst the Hebrew people, while we refer to their faith as being monotheistic, in practice, they weren't always monotheistic. They were what we call monolatrists, meaning that they believed that their God was one, but they also acknowledged other gods. They believed other gods were real, even though we don't believe they are real. So Baal for them was a reality, and the gods of the Canaanite pantheon. So, and even in the Hebrew Bible, when God is referred to amongst, what we generally call the angels, the heavenly creatures, or the other personalities within what the Old Testament, what we refer to in the Old Testament as the concept of divine counsel. Just think about Job chapter 1. God meets together with the divine council, and amongst them is Satan. Where have you been? There's conversations there. I mean, you read a passage like Psalm 82, which talks about that God amongst the gods of where God is, what we describe as in heaven. And so the word Elohim often refers to those that are in God's presence. They are also Elohim. And human beings, are described when they are there as Elohim. So there's more to the word Elohim, which, often in our English translations, the English translators have to, they have to kind of play with that. What exactly is this? In fact, one of the typical examples of this is Psalm 8. O Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. And then the psalmist says, what is man that you are mindful of him? The Son of Man that you care for him. Now, often we think Son of Man, there is a reference to Jesus, but it's actually referring to human beings. And then the psalmist says, and you have made him a little lower than
the angels.
Elohim. And so the NIV says, no, it can't be God. It has to be the angels. So the word Elohim there in the NIV is translated as the angels. Those that are part of the space where God is, the heavenly council. So once again, I'm just saying that to tell you that, while we just easily translate the word Elohim as God, context is going to be important to understand what exactly it means. So one has to be very careful. But we will always go for, what is the, especially when we're learning a language like Hebrew, what is the most common way for that to happen? And so the most common translation for Elohim that happens most of the time will be God, in which in the context you have to determine, is it a reference to God or is it a reference to gods? Whether it is those who find themselves to be part of God's heavenly council, or whether it's the foreign gods. Because the Hebrew Bible doesn't always make distinction. The context tells you that there is a distinction. The other word, and in fact, there's a relationship between the singular form. Now some scholars argue that the singular form of Elohim is El, and some say no, it's not, that there's another form, which we don't typically find in the Hebrew Bible. But the word El is actually at the root of the word Elohim. And that is the singular form that's used in the Hebrew Bible, used for God. But often used in constructions, used in constructs, in relation to and with other words. So, for example, if you think about, what we always say at Christmas, He is what? Emmanuel, which translates as God with us. And later on you're going to see that all that is happening in that word is the combination of a preposition, the word im, together with a what we call a personal pronoun, which means us, manu, and then el, which is God, which is the singular form of the word. And then you put that together, you get Emmanuel, which means God with us. And so the word el, instead of using the fullness of the word Elohim, the shortened form is often used in the Hebrew Bible on its own, but sometimes used with many other words and prepositions, to describe God in different ways. So that's very interesting. So here are some examples, and I'm sure you would have heard sermons on this. God is El Shaddai. You'd have heard that. God Almighty. Genesis chapter 17, Psalm 22. There are many places, where God is described as El Shaddai. Now the word El, once again, a borrowed word from the Canaanite pantheon, was actually within the Canaanite pantheon to be the chief god. So if you think about what you're probably familiar with is the Greek pantheon and the Roman pantheon. So the Romans just borrowed their gods from the Greeks, but they just named them something else. So for example, in the Greek pantheon, you have a chief god. Okay, the God who is the God above all the gods. That is, who is Zeus. Okay? So Zeus in the Greek pantheon is the father, the chief. Well, he isn't the father of the gods. He fathers some of the gods, but he's the chief god. Right? So that's him. The Romans came along. They borrowed the same god. They just named him differently. They called him Jupiter. Right? The Canaanites also had a chief god in their pantheon. He was El. El is the father of Baal in the Canaanite pantheon. So you encounter Baal. You also encounter El's wife in the Hebrew Bible, and her name was Asherah. So you find these people mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, but you don't know, who are they exactly. Okay. So the word El, because that was the word that is also used, so the Hebrew Bible borrows that Canaanite word and says, but we want this word to be used, for our God, because they didn't come up with a, besides what we will see later on, very soon now, is how God reveals himself to his people by means of a personal name. The Hebrew Bible has got no qualms in using the description of the chief pantheon within the Canaanites and to use that for God. But what the Hebrew Bible does is to show how El is different to the El of the Canaanites. And so it does that by using other descriptors like El Shaddai, he's God Almighty. He is El Roi, the God who sees. He is El Elyon, the God who is on high, or the most exalted, or the everlasting one, the one who is eternal. He is El Yisrael, he is the God of Israel. He's not the El of the Canaanites, he's the El that specifically the God, because that's what the word El means, it just means God. Okay? God in Afrikaans, and think of what are some of the words that you might translate that in Xhosa or Zulu, so whether it is Nkulunkulu or whatever. Or even in descriptions like Beit El, Bethel, the house of God, the place where El is to be found. Because El reveals himself, God reveals himself there in a very personal way. So you think about the Jacob story, so God reveals himself at that particular place, and then Jacob says, this place is special, there's a stairway to heaven here, there seems to be access directly to God. And so this is therefore going to be the house of God. Because that's always their understanding, where God reveals himself, where he's seen, where there is what we call a theophany, an appearance of God, that's often associated in a very special way. And so that's what the Hebrew Bible does, to make sure that one doesn't confuse El with, the other El. The God of the Bible will be described, in this way, but it uses then this singular form, the shortened form of the word in order to do that. Right, so that then is just a little bit of a background into how broadly, God is spoken of in the Hebrew Bible. But then God is spoken of in a very, very specific way as well, and in a very personal way. But as you're going to see, even that personal way in which God is referred to is also a little bit of an enigma. Because somehow or the other, which I think is a theological concept that we need to understand in the Bible, and especially in the Old Testament, while God takes the initiative of revealing himself, even in his revelation, he also still conceals. And part of that is, that we are creatures, he's the creator, can the creatures ever understand, conceive, or observe the divine completely? So while God does reveal, God shares specific information about himself, including his name. While that says something about God, it also hides something of his character. Now, you must understand this, that the concept of names, especially in the Old Testament, in the ancient world, in the ancient Near East, was a very powerful concept. The minute you name something, you are actually revealing and affirming something of the character of that person. So unlike us, that we like to name often, with not much reference to culture. Like culture doesn't play an important role. We might name according to the culture of television or sports, because you like soccer and Ronaldo's a great guy, so my son is going to be named Ronaldo. Or sometimes, we say we want to name a person after the grandparent, or some character, So there's always some kind of influence, something that influences us in giving a name. But in the ancient world, naming would be a process. Naming wasn't just something which happened at birth, but naming was something that happened after birth. Because as the character of the person comes to be revealed, they would then say, no, this person is actually named this, because it's an indication of who they are as a person. So in the ancient world, somebody asks you, what is your name? That's a very deep question. Because what they're wanting to know is not just what is the label, that has been given to you to distinguish you from other people. It's actually a description of who you are like as a person. So if my name is Jacob, and Jacob means deceiver, and I come, hi, my name is Jacob, they're like, whoa, we have to watch this guy, because why was he named Jacob? And that's why God changes his name, and so they would, what we often have, and this is even true about specific people in the Bible, that often people go by more than one name. And I'm not just talking here Paul and Saul, that's got to do with Paul's status as a Roman citizen and as a Jew, because Paulos was his Roman name and Saul was his Jewish name, and some people have often wrongly assumed that his name changed because he was converted, and that's to illustrate. Nothing to do with that. It's got to do with how he's known within different contexts. Because Saul is a typical Jewish name, Hebrew name. Paul is a typical Roman name. So he's known by both. And so even kings, when they get enthroned, they get given an enthronement name. And some of those names, we then need to understand wasn't just the birth name of the person, it was actually the title that tells you something about how their reign became characterized. In fact, many scholars believe that even David's name was, in all probability, his enthronement name. It wasn't the name that his father gave him. He's remembered, throughout his life as David. But David is actually a very unique name in the Bible. I mean, why is only one person named David? Because the word David actually just means beloved. My beloved, And so that becomes a name, like the word Malachi. Malachi is actually a title. It means my messenger. And so to what degree does the name actually reflect what the person's name was, or maybe reflect how they came to be understood, or came to be remembered, or came to be renamed? So there's a lot of subtlety around names, but chiefly because a name has got power. And that power is, it reveals something of the character of the person, which was very important in a religious setting, because if you know the name of a God, it was understood that you've got power over that God. Because if you chant that name, it becomes like an incantation. It becomes almost a guarantee that the God is going to act on your behalf. And so you begin to see, even in the Hebrew Bible, part of the reason why, even though there was a revelation regarding God's personal name, why there also seems to be a hiding of some of those aspects. Right. So here we now focus on what we then call, what has come to be known as the divine personal name. Because Elohim and El is just a general term, God. Which God? Trevor Noah's got a very, very funny sketch, when the British invades India. Have you ever watched that? What God? Because Hindus have got billions of gods, 2.5 million maybe, but the British only has one God, so the Indian guy would say, no, what God? It's God. That means nothing, because God is a general term. Doesn't this God have a name, to tell you something about him? So that is what we often refer to as the personal name or the covenant name of God. The name that God revealed to his people for them not to confuse him with any other God. A very, very unique name. And that name is represented by 4 consonants, generally therefore called the 4 consonants, the four characters, the tetragrammaton, that's what it means, or the 4 letters, which is the Hebrew letters Yod, He, Vav, He. Okay? So that is the consonants that makes up the personal name for God. Which, in other words, it's not just about Elohim, that general title, or El, or general descriptors about God. This is God revealing his character and his nature to his people and say, let me tell you what my name is, and that's what comes up in the Hebrew Bible as the tetragrammaton, the 4 letters, the Yod, He, Vav, He. In which the question is, how do we pronunciate that name? Because we've got a tradition today, as to how we say that name, but it is actually a tradition. It's not, it's not an absolute certainty that that's how his name is to be said. And I'll tell you the story of that now, why that is the case. The correct pronunciation of this name is actually unknown. Because it became lost in history. Now, why was that the case? Well, it seems to be the case that with time, over history, the decision was made sometime within the history of the Old Testament to stop pronunciating God's personal name, or what we call the divine name. Likely because of one of 2 reasons. Oath-taking, because that's even something that people do today, Swear on the Bible, swear by, on your mother's grave, swear by God's name, that this is true. And so it seems to be in relation to what we call the 3rd commandment. You shall not use the name of the Lord your God in vain. Now, what exactly does that mean? Because we often say, it means that you mustn't swear using God's name, which I think is a bad idea anyway, which is quite typical of the modern day and age, even on television and in the movies, use God's name by which to utter profanity. But there is kind of a positive side to that, in which, in law cases, you can swear on the Bible or swear by God, that what you're saying is the truth. But there's actually more to that 3rd commandment than just that. It's got to do with this understanding and this idea that names carry power. In that a name, and what I mean by that is a name reveals the character of a person. And so the name would then be understood to reveal something of the nature of God. And if you do that and you know that, you now have a magic formula within the ancient Near East. When I know the name of a God, I have got power over that God. Because when I say that name, that invokes the God. It's like a magical incantation, and therefore God has to respond. And it seems as if the Jews wanted to avoid that. Don't assume that because you know God's name, you've got power over God. Because God never reveals his name for that reason. And so what then happened was there was a practice that whenever one would read the Bible, which became a practice in the way in which people spoke, they actually stopped pronunciating God's name. However it was that they pronunciated the Yod, He, Vav, He, with whatever the vowels were that were included in that. And so that meant that when they were reading the Bible, they were reading a text, and when you would come across what we call the tetragrammaton, God's name, they would actually pause They wouldn't pronunciate it, they wouldn't say it, and they would skip over it and they would go on reading. Which obviously becomes very clumsy, becomes very awkward, doing that. But it did result that with time, that practice resulted in the loss of the tradition as to how God's name was to be said, how it was to be pronunciated. And so what they decided to do in order to make things easier for themselves, because it's very difficult, Now you want to say, the Lord is my shepherd. Now, the word Lord there is the divine name, So how do you say it? Is my shepherd? It's like, what silence your shepherd? It becomes very awkward. So what they decided to do was they said, instead of pausing, which becomes very cumbersome, isn't it maybe possible to find another word that we can read in place of that place where the Lord's name occurs? And that's the decision they made. They made the decision that they're going to be using the Hebrew word that means my Lord, the word Adonai. That's what that word is. Aleph, Dalet, Nun, pointed with a Chatei Patach, pointed with a Cholim, pointed with a Patach Yod at the end. The word Adonai literally means my Lord, which is derived from the word Adon, which means Lord. So the noun form, the absolute form of the noun, is the word Adon, that means Lord. So think of the word Kurios, that's actually your Hebrew equivalent of that, which can be used in reference to God, but can also be used in respect to people. Because the word Kurios could actually be translated as sir, as a word of respect. The Hebrew word my is actually captured, and you're going to learn this in the second semester. That ending over there, that Patach Yod, actually means my, the Lord of me, my Lord, in Hebrew. So by the time of the Masoretic work, these group of scholars that sought to preserve the Hebrew Bible, what was their task? They said, well, we have to take the consonantal text. We know what the oral tradition is in relation to that text, how it's supposed to be pronunciated. They then had to invent symbols that will come to represent the vowel sounds as well as the accents, as you have learned. And by the time the Masoretes did that, they already knew that the tradition is that when you come to the Tetragrammaton, you don't actually read what is in the text. You read something in the place of what's in the text. You read, my Lord. So how are they going to do that? How do you read that, which is as my Lord, which is that. So the Masoretes had to be very creative. And so this is what the Masoretes did. The Masoretes said, okay, we know that whenever we come to the Tetragrammaton, whenever we come to that in the Hebrew Bible, we don't attempt to read that. We say that. Right? So how are we going to help anybody to read the Hebrew Bible and to do that? So they said, okay, let's get clever. What we're going to do is, they're going to take the vowel points of the word Adonai. Okay, that Chatei Patach, the Cholim, and the Patach at the end. And they are going to add that to the Tetragrammaton. Others are going to take the divine name, and you can see there, Chatei Patach, Cholim, Vav. They're going to add it to the divine name, which when you grammatically correct it, you get this. Because Chatei Patach normally occurs on gutturals, right? And so when you're dealing with a normal yod, then you drop the Patach part and you get the Shava. And we retain the O and we retain the Va, and then what do we get? Jehovah. So when you do that and you attempt to read this, you get Yehovah. So that's where the name Jehovah comes from. But the Masoretes they weren't trying to invent a new word. And it's purely because of the way in which our English Bible came to be translated and the way in which it was influenced, especially from Martin Luther's German translation, in which in German, the sound that the yod makes is the same sound that the J makes, but that doesn't happen in English. That got influence into the English Bible, so that we then, now in English, incorrectly, we transliterate a yod with a J. And so you get Jehovah. And that's why a lot of people believe, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, that God's name is Jehovah. But when you sing that song, I sing that song in a different way. There's no God like Jehovah. Because there is no God called Jehovah. There is a misunderstanding around what the Masoretes did in trying to help people when they read God's name to actually recognize that what we have on the divine name is simply the vowel points of the word Adonai. And all the Masoretes was doing was trying to tell anybody who, when you come to God's name, you mustn't try and read what's there. You must read what is being indicated by practice. And that you must read my Lord. You must read Adonai. Now this introduces for us a very interesting phenomenon that the Masoretes came up with to try and deal with issues like this. It is called the Ketiv Kere phenomenon. The Ketiv Kere phenomenon. Now the word Ketiv Kere are Aramaic words because the Masoretes were essentially not just Hebrew speakers, they were Aramaic speakers, and they recognized that there was a lot of stuff happening in the Hebrew Bible that, just like with reading the divine name, but there were other ways in which people tried to be respectful in reading biblical Hebrew, including how you deal with spelling mistakes in the Hebrew Bible, or words that are old spellings that have been replaced by newer spellings. So how does one deal with this? So the Masoretes came up with this practice called Ketiv Kere, where Ketiv means so it is written, but Kere means so it is read. So it is read. Now I'm going to illustrate to you how this happens. Now take note that this is a medieval tradition of the Masoretes, because remember the Masoretes worked somewhere between the year 500 and the year 1000. That's when they did their work, which by that time this practice became well established, in which what the Masoretes did wasn't just to preserve the text by copying it, but the Masoretes also tried to indicate to the reader of the text what the oral tradition was actually also doing. So that when you read a text in Hebrew, you needed to also watch what was happening in the margins. Because they would tell you, and they would come up with symbols, which in the modern Hebrew Bible, we've come up with modern symbols because, our modern Hebrew Bibles can't capture what we call the critical apparatus. In other words, how the Hebrew Bible varies in different textual traditions, but also how to capture the work of the Masoretes and in how they sought to preserve the text, and so the Masoretes had their way of doing it, which is preserved in the Hebrew Bible, but we also had to find another way of doing that because we can't in the Hebrew Bible record all of the Masoretic works. So this is where the Ketiv Kere convention comes in. So the Ketiv Kere convention is most noted in medieval Hebrew manuscripts, but it does reflect an older tradition. So in other words, this tradition of not always reading what is in the text is an ancient tradition, because the Masoretes, and you need to know how to read the Hebrew Bible to be able to see this with the Masoretic notation. But I'm going to show you how they dealt with this concept. So the Masoretes, they sought to be very meticulous in their scribal work, okay, because they wanted to preserve the text. But occasionally, in doing that, because they didn't have photocopy machines, everything was recorded by hand, the Masoretes would sometimes discover mistakes. Which you shouldn't be ashamed of or worried about the integrity of the Bible, because this has not got to do with the doctrine of biblical inerrancy. The doctrine of biblical inerrancy has got to do with the message of the Bible, and not if there weren't spelling mistakes in the Bible, because there were many spelling mistakes, not just in the Greek New Testament, but in the Hebrew Bible as well. And so a lot of mistakes was spelling. So when the Masoretes would come across a mistake, they would say, "Oh, here's a mistake." But they wouldn't automatically rectify the mistake. They would leave it there. But then they had to come up with some way to show you that this is a mistake. You must. The way to pronunciate this word is not the way it is in the text, but it's to be read in this way. They also did that based upon how the text was euphemized. Because sometimes that's what would happen. When you read the Hebrew Bible and you do literal translations, there's some embarrassing stuff that happens in the Hebrew Bible. There's some stuff, and you just need to read. Read, for example, King James translations of the Old Testament and read NIV, and you will see, how they euphemize, how they take stuff that we would say, in modern day society and culture, that's a bit, can we use words like that, in civilized language, And that words occur in the Bible, and the Masoretes were often, they recognized, that there was an embarrassment about that. Is there maybe a more civilized way of saying this? And so how do we do that? How do we preserve this concept in the text, but how do we present a more civilized way of doing it? And what they would do is they would actually mark words like that. Words that they felt, and this was often in their tradition. We're coming across words in the Hebrew Bible that here is, this has to be read in public, and there's children around, and this word is, might not be as civilized, and so let's rather read something else in its place, But we all know that what it is actually recorded in the text. And so they came up with a notation out of respect for the text. They would not automatically rectify mistakes, like spelling mistakes, but they would preserve the text as it is written, because that's the tradition. It has to be, but we know that the written tradition has got a mistake. In the margin, they would then indicate, but this is how it's supposed to be read. And then they would employ the Hebrew symbol kof as a way to indicate that reading. Now let me give you an example of this. And let me say to you, there are hundreds of examples in the Hebrew Bible. Okay? But let me give you one typical example of this. Now this is a passage, I just taken a snapshot out of Deuteronomy chapter 28 to illustrate how this happens. Okay? So in Deuteronomy chapter 28, especially verse 27, this is the Lord speaking to his children in very harsh terms. The Lord, this is now Moses telling the people, that if they don't follow the law, this is what the Lord is going to do to them. The Lord will afflict you with the boils of Egypt. And, says the NIV, he's going to afflict you with tumors. Now that doesn't sound, okay, it sounds bad, but what does the Hebrew Bible actually say? When you read the Hebrew Bible, it doesn't say tumors, it says hemorrhoids. The word is hemorrhoids, and it is replaced with tumors. Now, how do we know that? If you take a look here where I point out the arrows, so this is verse 27 in Deuteronomy chapter 28. So that's the verb that means he will inflict. Who will inflict? The Lord. There's a tetragrammaton. He will inflict. And then you have over here, the word is with boils. That bait over there is an inseparable preposition that means with boils of Mitzrayim, of Egypt. That's the Hebrew word for Egypt. The Lord will inflict you with boils from Egypt, and then you have this word over here, which is the Hebrew word ophelim. Now the Hebrew word ophelim, if you translate it literally, is hemorrhoids, piles. You know, the Masoretes said, "Woo!" You know, we know, however, that that's not how this is read. So what they do is in the margin, you see that cough over there. See it over there. Above it is the word that means and tumors. And tumors. So the Masoretes said, we know that the tradition is, we don't say piles. You know, because it's very offensive. I mean, goodness, the Lord is going to inflict you with piles. You know, that sounds like a teenage insult. You know? And so what they would do is, and so the modern way of showing that reference is, you see that little circle above the word over there. Okay, that is how the modern Hebrew Bible does it. You know, to show you, in the margin, there is a comment, a Masoretic comment about this. That Masoretic comment is a kere. That kere is that it has to be read, it has to be called that word over there, which is the word for tumors. But when you read this, we all know, you know, that the word is actually piles, you know, which doesn't sound very civilized, you know. So you would have to read the text, and you have to read it. So the Masoretes, when they would read it, they would read, and the Lord will afflict you with boils from Egypt. And, take note, there's a thing in the margin. What does the margin say? And with tumors. And with tumors. So the Masoretes said, don't read what's in the text. We know what's in the text. Read what's in the margin. And in the margin it says, and with tumors, and that's how the NIV translates it. They translate the way in which the Masoretes said it has to be read. That is called the Ketib Kere phenomenon. And there are many examples of that in the Hebrew Bible. You know, where they say, instead of reading what's in the text, out of respect for the text, or sometimes they come to the text and they say, but that word is obviously spelled wrong. But we're not going to rectify the spelling mistake. But we don't want people to read the spelling mistake. We want them to read the corrected form. The corrected form is in the margin. So that when you read, you see the reference, you read in the margin, you say, the margin gives you the correct spelling. Let me give you one more example of this, where our English translation makes the mistake. Well-known Psalm, Psalm 23. Now you're going to confess your sins before the Lord because you have mistranslated Psalm 23. Why? Because right at the end of the psalm, the psalmist says, surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. And then our English translation says, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The Masoretic note says, don't read the word dwell. Read the word return. And I will return to the house of the Lord. Now, why that is the case is because there's a very, very subtle spelling, because both those verbs in Hebrew are what we call weak verbs. That when the verb goes through its changes, you know, and you're going to learn this when you're going to be learning your paradigms for the Hebrew verb, it looks like the verb to dwell. Why? Because very earlier in another psalm, you see where the psalmist says, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord. But the Masoretes know that, and they say, it's quite possible that a person reading Psalm 23 can misread this verb to mean dwell, when the verbal form is actually a verbal form. And in the margin they tell you this verbal form occurs in Genesis, where it means to return and not to dwell. The mistake that our English translations do is we don't read the Masoretic text always, you know, and so tradition has now become scripture for us. And we say, oh, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. However, that is actually a mistake. The Masoretes pointed out in the Hebrew Bible that you should read Even though it is, they weren't saying that there's a spelling mistake here. They were saying you need to see the subtlety of how this word, which consonantally is exactly the same as the verb that means to dwell. But the Masoretes remembered the tradition that this verb, which is spelled consonantally exactly the same as the verb that means to dwell, they knew, based on their tradition, it had to be read to return. And they put that in the margin. But our English translators, and this happens because of the King James Version, because the King James version of the Bible, its translators didn't read the Masoretic notes. And so they went with, what seems to be obvious. Now, does that change our theology? No, it doesn't. It just changes our reading. Okay? So one has to be very, very careful, as I said, HEB1a, what happens with the divine name? In fact, in the very same passage, you see HEB1a. That is just the divine name. And what the Masoretes did was, they didn't have to point that out. And this is what scholars call a perpetual kere. Meaning that whenever you come across the divine name in the Hebrew Bible, no matter what the vowel points are, because you're going to discover that the vowel points aren't always the same. I showed you the typical one where the vowel points come directly from Adonai. But sometimes they even leave the cholim out. And sometimes they even use the vowel points of Elohim onto the divine name, which you're going to make for some. And we're going to see the reason why they did that. But this is a perpetual kere, meaning when you come to a word like this, you need to automatically know. That's the divine name. You don't attempt to read what is there. You take a look at the vowel points and you say, what is the vowel points indicative of? In this instance, it's indicative of the word Adonai. Don't read what is there. Yeva, read the vowel points. The vowel points is Adonai. So you read that word as Adonai. Always you do that. You don't say Jehovah. They never said Jehovah because there was no word like Jehovah. Jehovah is a misunderstanding as to what the Masoretes was doing.
And so
yes.
Before you go, how do I identify that it has to be translated that way? You said, what is the indication?
Yeah. So you need a good English translation. So for example, the NIV sometimes does this, in which they will put it in the footnote.
Okay.
They will say the Hebrew also means, or the Masoretic tradition is that. They don't do it all the time. They do it a lot of the time. A translation like the New English Translation, which is one of the more recent academically credible translations of the Bible, and especially if you use the online version, or even if you use the new version of the Net Bible, they will often indicate that, and they will put a little thing there, and when you click on it, they will tell you, this is the Masoretic tradition around how this is to be read is this, and that is why we've translated it this way. And sometimes the translators will actually translate what is actually in the Bible if they don't find it to be offensive. But yeah, when that change happens, then they will often, especially if it's important, then they will. But sometimes they just say, it's not that important. We're not even going to indicate it because there's no doctrine or no. The ultimate meaning of the text is not negatively affected by it.
Sorry, Doc, which
Yes.
translation did you say is the most recent and academic?
In the New English Translation.
Okay.
As a look, what is the best Bible translation? That depends on who you're talking to. I've used the NIV, and the NIV is still a reliable translation. But you must also understand that each Bible translation has got its translation philosophy. And the translation philosophy of the NIV tends to be dynamic equivalence. So they tend to like to iron things out, for the sake of clarity. But in doing that, you often miss subtleties. Your more direct translations, your translations that tend to be more literal, like the New American Standard Bible, the New English Translation, they will often tend to go with what's actually in the text. In fact, even the King James did that. So in fact, the King James translation of that verse is hemorrhoids. It's modern translations that says, oh, no, we will stick with the Masoretes, you know. Yeah. Because the King James translators, no, they didn't have access to all of the Masoretic texts like we have. Yeah, so just in terms of the meaning, modern Jews will refer to the Tetragrammaton as the name. They will say it in Hebrew, it is Hashem, the name. Modern Jewish printed forms will indicate the divine personal name by translating it often as G-D, meaning that, because we're using English, whenever the divine name, the Tetragrammaton, occurs within the text or is being directly referred to, that's just another way of, respecting God's name, that it won't be translated. Modern Bible translations like the NIV will indicate the presence of the divine name by capitalizing the word Lord, L-O-R-D. So they are capturing the Masoretic tradition that you don't attempt to pronunciate God's name, the covenant name, but to show you that this is not the word Adonai, but that is actually the divine name being pronunciated as Adonai. They will then use capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. It is postulated that the divine name would probably have been pronunciated as Yahweh, as we say. But even there's actually a subtlety based even on the Hebrew that you have learned thus far that should tell you that we shouldn't actually be pronouncing it as Yahweh. Why? Because of this thing over here, this hay. Remember, hay becomes quiescent where? Only at the end of a word. But inside a word you must hear the hay. In English, hay inside a word becomes part of the vowel, so we say Yahweh. However, in Hebrew, if it was to be pronunciated, you must hear the hay. So it should actually then be pronunciated Yahweh. That's how we should actually say it. Yahweh. Because you must hear the hay, according to Hebrew grammar. But once again, it was never supposed to be pronunciated. So even arguing, that that's what it should be is almost besides the point. So, can we use Yahweh? Of course you can. There's no problem using Yahweh. But there's a problem when you insist that it is Yahweh. There's a problem when you insist it is Jehovah. Because both of that, it's a misunderstanding, So what scholars have done is, they have gone through a process of educated guesses based upon a few things. Okay, so it is uncertain as to what the exact meaning of the divine personal name is. Most scholars postulate that its meaning may be found in the verbal form of the verb to be of when God spoke to Moses in Exodus chapter 3. And that's what Exodus chapter 3 looks like. Unpointed, pointed text. Let me read it for you in Hebrew over here. And so Moses, remember, asked God, when I go to them, they know of the God of their ancestors, but the identity of the God of their ancestors is lost. They've got to know many other gods in Egypt. If I go into Pharaoh and says, let my people go, and if I go to the people and say, I've met God in a very personal way, and that God says you must leave Egypt, they're going to say, like the Indians said to Trevor Noah, what God? Who's God? What God? God who? That's Moses. So what God does is God reveals to Moses, and God says, you say to them, HEB1a L12, and he said, God said, to, that's what the word L over there means. It's not El, which is God. That's the preposition. That means to Moshe, which is the word for Moses in Hebrew. And this is what God says to Moses. You say to them, this over here, which is the verb, HEB1a, I will be, HEB1a, I will be. Or, as we translate it, in the present tense, I am who I am has sent you. So what does God do? God is revealing to Moses something about his identity. But God is also hiding something of his identity. It is enough. So scholars say, well, how does one then actually do that? So with I will be who I will be, how would the people have heard that? Because Moses would have gone to them and Moses would have said to them, God has said what? Not I will be who I will be. God has said he will be who he will be. And when you say he will be, then the aleph changes to a yod. And then you have got something that looks just like the divine name, the Yod HEB1a. And so scholars say that what was happening there, God was not only revealing of himself to Moses, he was also not giving the exact meaning of his name. He was hinting at what his character was and what his identity was. And so what God was probably doing was saying to them something like, I exist, and I'm going to put this later on, but also that I am the eternal one. Because that is what the verb to be in its imperfect form will mean. That I'm the one who will continue to be who I am. Because I've always been the one who I am, and I always will be the one who I am. I will always be the one that exists.
Yeah, and there's so many things in there, because you could even point to his sovereignty, like I choose to be who I am.
Yes.
So there's so many things in there.
There's a lot of things that's kind of so there is a sense in which it was enough for Moses and it was enough for the people.
Yeah.
That because they've never heard of any God who's named that.
Yeah.
They've never understood that. This is unique. Here's somebody who's declaring. Another way of reading it could be, no matter what you think a God is, I'm that and more.
Yeah.
So it's like a massive revelation, but at the same time, it's also you can't exactly put your finger on it.
Yeah.
There is a mystery about it. There's an enigma about it.
Yeah, there's like no limit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm the limitless God is a way in which it can also be translated. But in doing that, it's not adequate, to translate what God was busy saying. It's a big thing.
Yeah.
And so you must understand, why the Jews were upset when Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. Which in Aramaic is going to be very similar to the Hebrew as I am, I will be. Why did they go? Why? What's he doing? He's saying he is the one who was revealed, to Moses. Okay. So look, it does mean that in the Hebrew Bible it can be sometimes clumsy, because what happens if you've actually got not just the tetragrammaton, which happens, but also the word Adonai. So the way in which that happens is in the Hebrew Bible, if you do have the tetragrammaton preceded by or even followed by the word Adonai, then it's obviously awkward, to say Adonai. When the text is not actually saying that. So what happens is the Masoretes then came up with other ways of dealing with that phenomenon. So they would actually, in that instance, when the word Adonai appears before the tetragrammaton, they would use the vowel points for Elohim. And they would add that to the tetragrammaton, which then gives you this word that if you attempt to say it, it is Yehovah. Not even Jehovah anymore. Now it's something else. But grammatically corrected to Yevi, which is one of the other ways. So it's not just Yeva or Yehovah, but sometimes it's also just Yevi. And once again, it was the Masoretes trying to point out to you, this is the vowel points of the word Elohim. So that when you have this construction, you've got the tetragrammaton with the word Adonai preceding it, and you add the vowel points of the word Elohim, that is read as the Lord God. So now you take the word God and you read it in the place of the tetragrammaton. Because the Masoretes said you read Elohim there. So you read this construction as Adonai Elohim, which we translate as the Lord God. Right, so the word Adonai occurs many places in the Hebrew Bible. So just like we found with El Roy, El Shaddai, etc., Adonai also occurs with, for example, Adonai Yireh, Jehovah Jireh. That's how we translate that as. But that literally means the Lord who will see. He will see to it. In other words, He will provide. But literally it means the Lord sees. Or Adonai Tsevaot, the Lord of hosts. Or Adonai Ro'i, the Lord is my shepherd. That's the way Psalm 23 starts, and it actually occurs elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, like in Ezekiel 34. Or Adonai Rofecha, or what we will say as Jehovah Rapha, the Lord who heals you. The Lord who heals you. Adonai Rofecha, the Lord who heals you. Okay, so what then does it mean? As I said, based upon how we understand and we translate what God said to Moses in Exodus chapter 3 from verse 13 to verse 14. Then Moses asked God, if I go to the Israelites and say to them, the Lord of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask, what is his name? What am I to tell them? God says to them, we translate this in the present tense, I am who I am, because that is how Moses would have reported it. God said, I am who I am, but he would have reported it as the past tense, he will be who he will be. And so say to the Israelites, I am is the one who has sent you, which when we ask the question, what exactly does that mean? Well, it seems to be that what God is referring to here by using this well-known verb, the verb of existence, the verb to be, that God is saying something about his existence. Which, when we look at it in the imperfect, that's how it occurs in the Hebrew Bible, I will be. When they relate to the people, would be like that. Okay? He will be who he will be is Yih, and you can see it looks just like the Tetragrammaton. Yod-Heh, instead of Yod-Heh, Vav-Heh. And so scholars have come to the conclusion, this is both Jewish and Christian scholars, for this reason they believe that the divine name has got something to mean about existence or existing eternally.
It's like a characteristic.
A characteristic.
Like
characteristic.
You mentioned, they name somebody based
name
on.
Means, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
The name means something. It's communicating. It's communicating meaning. But once again, let me say, there's no absolute certainty about this of what the divine covenant means. The best educated guess is it means the existing one. Modern translations like the NIV will indicate the presence of the divine name by using the word Lord. It is postulated that the divine name would probably have been pronunciated Yahweh. It's a guess, an educated guess. But once again, the most likely form based upon scholarly opinion and typical Hebrew grammar. There are, however, a number of other possibilities. So in fact, this is some of the videos you will find. Where they say, well, if we understand this concept of Matrix Lectionis, remember that it could actually have been Yahuwah or it could have been Yehovah. Those are also possibilities. And in fact, some says that's the case. But most scholars say no, it's possibly Yahweh. The name is also contracted, often just as Yah. So this is for the Rastafarians, Jah. Because even in the King James, that happens in the Psalms, the Yahwistic element, which occurs in expressions like Hallelujah, praise the Lord. In other words, praise Adonai. Is in Psalm 150, or sometimes in names, like the word Obadiah. Obadiah literally means the servant of the Lord, because it's noun, Eved, that means servant, with the what we call the Yahwistic element in it, which is the divine name, or Zachariah, which literally means the Lord remembers, or Azariah, which means the Lord helped. And so a lot of the kings, or a lot of the important people in the Bible, they have a name which has got this Yahwistic element in it. But as I said, many scholars believe that name wasn't necessarily their birth name. It was the name that was given to them when their contribution was remembered. Yeah. Any questions? That's it for dealing with and understanding the divine name in the Hebrew Bible. Interesting. Yeah. Okay, so don't go tell people, don't say Jehovah. You might rattle people's faith. Yeah, but if you find a way of helpfully explaining to them, why there's no such word as Jehovah, then it might be helpful. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you. Thanks, Doc.
Okay, see you, Naomi. See you, Gina.